familiar with Union, you come down the hill and on Highway 34, and the hotel was on the corner, and then there's a big grain elevator across there, and the railroad, Missouri Pacific Railroad, went through there. So they had an apartment in the entryway of that. There was still an office in the back, and incidentally, the rent at the hotel was $3 a month. And so they weren't paying very much either for their house. Anyhow, she got acquainted with Lowell's sister because of the cafe there was a lot in between the hotel, an empty lot, and the cafe. And so they got to be real good friends, and when Marcella would have a little spare time, sometimes she'd run down to see Esther, or Esther would come up and see her. So they were going to go to the Missouri Pacific Railroad dance at Falls City. Russ and Marcella who were running the cafe. That was Lowell's brother-in-law and Lowell's sister. So she said Lowell would like to go, but he didn't have a date. She said, would you like to go one day when I was up there with Esther? And I said, oh, I'd love to. So that's how I met Lowell. And so then we started going together.
And what year was that?
That would have been, let's see, we were married in 36, probably in early 35, 1935.
I want to get back to Lowell, but can you go back, and you told me a really interesting story about when you were about 2 and following your brother to school. Could you tell that story? Well, we lived east of Elmwood in a pretty good sized house that was about a quarter of a mile back in the field. And there was a long lane that come in from the road that was lined with pine trees, and then the house, and then over on the right was a pasture. So I was the youngest child then. Edith was born, but Clara wasn't born yet. And I was just 4, and Mom had let me go out and play, and pretty soon she'd look out and I wasn't there. She got real worried, and she called my name, and I didn't answer, and she got scared, and pretty soon here she saw the teacher. There was from the driveway that you come into the farm, you could go along the road about a quarter mile, and there was a schoolhouse there. And there's a creek that ran in front of that, which was an interesting story too, later. And so here's the teacher would be cutting across the pasture and holding my hand, and so mother, they got after me for going, and finally the teacher, then the next day I'd go out and I'd do the same thing, because I love the school. So the teacher said, just let her alone, let her go, because she doesn't bother anybody and it doesn't make a bit of difference. So Mom would be sure I had a clean dress on, and she'd let me out, and she'd say, now don't you go to school, but I would go anyhow, so I go to school. And in those days, the school desks were, a lot of them were double. They were the kind with the lid lifted up, and the inkwell was up here, and there was a pencil track across it. But they were double, and they were just like 2 people could sit there. Well, my brother wasn't very happy because he was in 1st grade, and he wasn't very happy about me coming to school and sitting by him. But he finally agreed to that. And so then the next year when I went to school, I skipped the 1st grade because I'd been to school so much I knew all those things. But it was really interesting about that school because I remember the teacher. Her name was Hazel Dellis Denier, and she had long hair, dark hair, and they wore their hair in those days back a lot with a knot in the back. And then the part that covered the ears, they had little hair. They called them rats, and they fit over the ear, and then the hair fit over the top there, so it gives them a little bit of style from the side. So one day when she was out on the playground watching kids, some of the boys snuck in there and put pins she'd take those rats out lots of times, and then she'd come to school because she could hear better without those covering her ears. And the boys put pins in the rats. She'd put them in the desk, and then they'd put tacks in her seat. And of course, she never could make a pinpoint of who was doing that. And they would do all kinds of things. And we had the old-fashioned bell that would, hand bell that would ring our time to come in.
What was the name of that school?
I'm trying to think. Salem College.
Okay.
Salem College is what it was. And then because the creek was fairly close on the other side, the kids could go skating there in the wintertime. It wasn't very far from the back door of the school to where the creek was. And so they had permission that they could skate in that. And one time the water wasn't quite frozen, and one of the guys fell in. So here he was, soaking wet, and teacher brought him in. And in the back of the school, they didn't have a special room for coats and hats. They had just hangers along the wall, and then they drew curtains. They had curtains over that. So she put him behind that, and he took off his clothes and his long underwear and stuff and put on somebody else's overcoat or undercoat, whatever it was, an overcoat. And then here he was, his underwear and his clothes were all hung around the pot-bellied stove in the middle of the school. It was quite an incident, and I remember that real well.
Tell us about your sister that was friends with Beth Streeter Aldridge's daughter.
With who?
With Beth Streeter Aldridge's daughter. You said your older sister, do I have this right, was friends with Mrs. Aldridge's daughter?
Oh, yes. My oldest sister was a classmate of Mrs. Aldridge's, Beth Streeter Aldridge's daughter, Mary. They were classmates. And my dad knew Mrs. Aldridge's husband, Cap, they called him, and they were good friends. And so I read every one of her books. I loved it.
Do you remember her, Martha? Do you remember her?
You mean Mary?
Beth Streeter Aldridge?
Uh-huh.
Do you remember her?
Uh-huh.
Had you ever been in her house? Or?
I had never been in her house, no. I've often thought I'd like to go now that they're...
We'll have to have that.
So sometime I think I'd like to go there.
What do you remember about her? Any memories of her? Mrs. Aldridge, what she looked like, or what was she like?
Not too much, because she was always writing. She was always busy writing, and the girls were good friends. And of course, I wasn't old enough. My oldest sister was 7 years older than I was, so I didn't know. But my sister stayed in Elmwood, as I said, because until she was 16 and able to drive, and then my dad gave her a car to drive back and forth. So she did that.
You told me about your mother talking about the influenza epidemic.
Oh, yes, that was in 1917, in World War I. And that was during that epidemic of the flu. And people were just dying like flies. And they did not have a hearse that come down and pick up people then. And they had a hay rack led with horses, and they would go down the streets and put the corpse in the hay rack. And she was scared to death. She had 4 children, and people were just dying like everything, and she was scared to death. She was afraid to go anywhere or take us anywhere. But it was a very sad, hard time, but we lived through that all right. We made that. It's fine.
Did she talk anything about World War I? Did she ever talk about that?
Not too much about that. They didn't have radios in those days, and communication was different, and so we didn't know very much about that. I was just really young, so I don't remember any.
Sure, that's before your time, really. Do you remember how they met? Did they talk about how your parents met each other? Was it, she was farming?
Well, my dad was a blacksmith, and he immigrated from Germany. I'm not sure about the age, but he came in through New Orleans. He had an aunt there. And then he had an uncle in Oklahoma. So after he left his Aunt Louise, he came to Oklahoma, and his Uncle Bill Bond, they pronounced it in English, but it was called Bone in German. And he worked there for a couple of years, and then he come on in into Nebraska because he had an uncle at Elmwood. And so then at Murdoch in those days, they had a festival in the fall that they called the Ford Days. And so Dad did some blacksmithing there, and he worked as a blacksmith at 4 days, and well, all the time. That's what he did for a living for some time. And that's where he met my mother. And
Did you speak German in the home? Did your parents speak German?
yes, a lot, and I used to learn a lot more German than I don't remember anymore. But I found I used it when I worked at the Masonic Home. There was a lady that would never take her medication. She was a German lady, and they just fight with her about taking her medication. But when I was on duty, I never had any trouble with her. So I come in one day, and they were working with her, and so I gave her medication. She wouldn't take it, so I told her in German that it was good for her. And she took it, and the girl said, "What on earth did you say to her that made her take that medication?"
Do you remember the words?
I just spoke a little German to her, and that's oh yeah, that word.
Do you remember the exact words you told her?
Yeah, I think biscold, biscuit.
Good.
This was good for her, yeah, and she took it, yeah. But we, the folks tried to not talk too much German so that we would speak English, because a community that we lived in later was that when the kids come to school, they couldn't speak English, and the folks did not want that, so they were real careful about that. But
You had a fun little story about picking flowers in the roadside, picking violets one time that you told my sister. Do you remember that? You were picking violets when you were a young girl and somebody came along in a car. Do you remember that? I think this was during the early part of the Depression.
and we were picking violets.
You were picking violets. You were telling my sister this story. And somebody came along in a car and said, "I'll buy those violets from you." Do you remember?
Oh, yeah, it was some people in an old Ford car, and so we did. They gave us pennies for the flowers. Yes, I hadn't thought about that incident for a long time, but you know, when you lived on the farm and the area that you farmed, when the pastures got dry in the fall, you could let your cows out on the road, but you had to herd them. You had to watch them to keep them from straying onto to the road. But of course, the roads were all dirt roads at that time, and you had to keep them from getting into the corn.